start by introducing all of ourselves, and then we'll get talking. But my name is Dan Gerstein. I worked with Fred and with Paul at Toys for Bob from a very early age, basically the start of my adult life. And now we're working on the Ur-Quan Masters sequel, which has just been retitled. We called it Ur-Quan Masters 2, but now called Free Stars Children of Infinity, the sequel to the Ur-Quan Masters. So that's me. And then Fred.
I'm Fred Ford. I've worked on many games, but the one we're hopefully going to chat mostly about, although going into Unholy War and anything else is great too, um, is the Ur-Quan Masters, which was first expressed in 1992 under the title Star Control 2.
And I'm Ken Levine. I'm the creative director of Ghost Story Games, working on this game Judas. Before that, it was Irrational Games, and we did BioShock Infinite, and System Shock 2, and we were talking earlier about Freedom Force. So, I haven't been around quite as long as Fred, but not that far off.
You'll catch up someday.
I'll catch up.
Anyway, thanks for joining. Just because it is sort of the thing on our minds, at least the best these days. What was your experience like with the Ur-Quan Masters? How did you encounter it? How did you play it? What was it like? And yeah.
And I remember we had a bunch of housemates, so we'd play multiplayer a ton and just do the melee mode. And I just loved it because the incredible thought of the balance between the different enemies and the creative powers. I love. Did you have Errol Otis working on? I think Eric did some of the artwork.
He did some of the like manual illustrations in the first iteration, but he did several of the alien paintings in Ur-Quan Masters.
So I loved him from Dungeons and Dragons, and then we were just, I mean, back then you had to go every game was an expense. I was broke and living in LA with a bunch of guys, and so we had to buy our cartridges carefully, and or I did. And so I remember we had that game, and we would just play melee to all hours of the night, and it led to lots of screaming and yelling at each other. And I love the strategy mode as well. I remember trying to get my head around the rotating starfield.
Yeah, some people can see it and some people can't.
Yeah, it took me. It was like all of a sudden I had this aha moment, and I saw it, but it took me about 2 months of trying to be able to understand. I think, like you said, some people have the visualization skill. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, they have this sort of really interesting, turn-based strategy game where you would move around this basically a grid of stars that all had invisible connections between each other. And because it was so, it was a raster TV running out, I don't know, what were they running out? Not even
not fast enough.
You had this very little glowing dots. And eventually, once you looked at it long enough, and it took me, as I said, about 2 months, you realized it was like a map, a 3D map that you could rotate around, and it existed in 3D space. And you could only move between certain nodes, and you had to be very careful plotting your moves. And I remember just spending tons of time just on that. And that's relative to, the games that came afterwards. That was a relatively crude expression of your ideas relative to what came later. But I just, the amount of thought that went into the different creatures, species design, the humor, the spot the butt missile, and, all these things were, it was funny, and it was smart, and it was interesting and complicated, and all running on this, incredibly basic piece of hardware. So I played that game to death.
Yeah, the first one was the first project that Paul and I worked together on. So it took us a little bit of time to get into our rhythm of working collaboratively and iterating. And so by the time we got to Ur-Quan Masters, we had that down pretty well. And although it was a long development, we were able to stretch further.
So I think something that's interesting I always think about is the kind of development tools you had then versus now. What was it like trying to make a game like with that complexity, with this big universe and this, with all these, dialogue trees and all these different modes of, like of space combat and the strategic movement and I think like it's very hard for young developers to understand. There's no engines, right? There was no sound library. Yeah. There was no, you had to write all your sound code and rendering text to the screen was, I imagine, really hard, especially you're trying to fit on those cartridges, at least with the first one. And then the second one, I don't think did the second one come out on any,
well, like 3DO, but
3DO, right? That had a little more power under the hood.
Back then it was kind of interesting because there were no genres yet. I mean, there weren't even first-person shooters, so there was no idea of this is the way you do things. And conversely, there was no idea of you can't do this. I mean, obviously the constraints of the hardware constrained you, but there was just why don't we do this? We want to do this. No one's telling us we can't. So it just was, let's get it done. And what I realized early on is that being the sole programmer on both of them, actually, I needed to program defensively, meaning I needed to offload the universe not on me. It had to be on somebody else, and it couldn't be on Paul either because he was mostly the other half of the equation. Although we hired some artists and writers and stuff like that. But so it just was, well, we're going to have to procedurally generate all this stuff. And
did that term even exist though at that point? Or was that just the natural way to describe it?
I don't know whether the term existed, but that is what it was. It was given a seed, like a star location, which acted as the seed for the planetary system underneath it, so that it could be recreated every time. And then I would just generate the planets and the orbits based on typically the star and its type and size and heat would kind of would influence what kinds of planets you would find there. And then if it was a hot star, you probably wouldn't find any life. And so it was all very procedural, except the Earth was the only planet that had a texture. I mean, a non-generated texture, because you wanted to recognize it as Earth. And it also had all of the planets. It had 9 planets, and they were roughly what they should look like in terms of gas giants and rocky worlds and coloring and stuff like that. But even those their surfaces were generated.
And you're doing this at 320-200, right? So it was like you had very little screen space to work with as well for a cloud.
Yeah.
So, it's funny because what you said about there were no genres. That's something I've said before too. And I think it's hard for people to understand right now. Like, when I started and we were doing Thief, there wasn't, like, people talk about the stealth genre and you just were like, well, what cool thing can I do? Right. And you didn't really think about the immediate categorization that you kind of do now. And that was very liberating, I think. And it was sort of a day when genres get calcified. And I think the indie space has done a really good job of breaking that up. I think we've seen a lot of new genres getting introduced in the past few years. It's harder in AAA because the costs are higher. But I think that's, eventually that will catch up to AAA, and you got to continue to find ways to innovate, because back then you had no choice but to innovate, because there was nothing everything was an innovation, right? Because unless you were just like making a Pong clone or a Pac-Man clone, Jawbreaker or something like that. So yeah, it must have been a very interesting, free feeling, but also, you're sort of too dumb to know that you're taking on an impossible task, right?
There was a lot of that. I mean, we basically started with the fighting engine from the first one. So we knew we had fighting,
Yeah.
and we knew we were going to add a bunch of ships for the new aliens. But so that was already solid, and then it was just how do we find ways to connect to that in the adventure game? And also we had that standalone Super Melee too, which released with the first with the second game, Ur-Quan Masters. Um, so we knew we had a solid core, and then it was just we want to build a story on top of it. And yeah, and then like you said, too dumb to know how hard that was going to be.
A non-linear story and with like in a very limited piece of technology. And like, how did you guys do the testing? Because it was open-ended, I presume. Getting you're never going to have anybody who you're never going to in any kind of testing process see all the various ways it can play out either, right?
We did. Accolade was our publisher, and they did have a test department who did try to go to every planet, um, and we didn't even really know sort of how we didn't intentionally distribute minerals and good minerals or and biologicals or anything like that. That was all procedurally done, and so we didn't actually discover our own universe until we made the hint book, where I wrote a program that would go to every world, not physically, but
Yeah.
basically visit every world and catalog what was on there, or what kind of biodiversity, what kind of minerals, what kind of weather and stuff like that. And then we just listed that all in the hint book, and we said, oh wow, if you go to this place, this star first, you're good. And it happened to be the ones that were the one that was close to Sol, I think it was Alpha Centauri, happened to be really rich in RUs and I mean, we knew where the stars were all placed. Paul placed the stars because he wanted recognizable constellations. But then after that, it was just generated, and we didn't try to balance the generation, but it worked out okay.
What were like some of the hardest like rendering side like technical problems like in graphics? I think because like the tool, it wasn't, there's no 3D cards, and obviously that game was in 2D, but like what were the kind of challenges you had back then in terms of rendering? Now we think about like triangles and other things.
A lot of assembly language. Well, there weren't any 3D objects. It was
Right.
all 2D top down. So so that wasn't too bad, but I had to write a lot of assembly language for the graphics, um, and getting digital sound out of the PC speaker was fun. uh, because it's just the normal little squeak
Yep. Yeah.
speaker. Uh, I mean, we also did Sound Blaster and stuff like that, but uh,
You had to like write all your own libraries too for all
yeah.
that. They didn't have any like APIs or any of any kind. Or
Well, I I'm an engineer by trade, and I worked at places before before and after gaming. I mean, I started in gaming while I was still in college, but then I graduated with a CS degree and thought I was supposed to work in Silicon Valley because that's what adults did. And then I said, this isn't any fun. I liked doing games better. And so I came back to games. So, I mean, I kind of knew how to put together big projects and with libraries. I had to write all the libraries, but I had libraries.
yeah, but I must have been a yeah. It's probably very hard for people to understand like how crude things were back then and how homemade everything was.
Yeah.
Now you got engines. There's no concept of an engine didn't even come along for quite a long period of time after that.
Yeah. I mean, I tried to write it too so that I could bring it into the future, what I was writing. And obviously over many years, all of that stuff probably disappeared or was assimilated, but it kept going for a long time. Um, I think at least through Unholy War, which you mentioned, which was very much like the first game with a strategy map and then fighting, and the the aliens were very much like ships. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you were building upon what you had before. Um, I played a ton of that game. I remember I wasn't aware it was from you guys. So I had seen it and I was like, I don't know what the hell this thing is. And then then I read somewhere that's from you guys. So I went and I got it. And yeah, and it was very much like those games. It just brought it, with 3D graphics and a new sort of IP. I liked it so much. We tried, you mentioned before about you didn't know what the genres were. And another thing that happens is sort of once you have a couple of games that are successful, those games sort of define your thinking, sometimes too. But back then we hadn't really had our successes. So we were looking at all different kinds of genres. We weren't sort of like a first person shooter company per se. I mean, though our first game was, System Shock 2, but it wasn't like, and I worked on Thief, but it wasn't sort of definitional yet. And so I had liked those games so much, both the Ur-Quan, Acorn Masters and Unholy War, that we had an idea for. I also did design this board game called what was it called? Monster Island, I think. And I did want to make like a kaiju game, but with a strategy mode and a melee mode. And I was probably really stupid to want to do that because I think the tight kind of balance you have in your melee mode in your games is so tight, and the movement. I presume you guys. I mean, you never know with older games because sometimes you just get really lucky because there wasn't that much time to go around. But I mean, how just tuning like the turn rates of the craft or whatever, and the movement speed, and the frames of the animation and where the bite would happen and stuff like that. I imagine probably I wasn't aware of how difficult it would make a game that felt good as those games did, because I had no experience with that kind of arcade control.
Yeah. Well, I think many people would say that it isn't balanced, but that's the intention, is that weaker ships don't cost as much. So
Well,
adding cost into the equation in Melee allows us to say, well, this ship will never beat this ship. But then also some ships that were weak against most ships were hard counters to like powerful ones. So
right. But there were some helpless battles. I remember, I think it was like the Federation style ship, and then I can't remember the exact name.
Earthling cruiser.
Yeah, with the missile. There were, I think, against the Ur-Quan, it was like really like hard. Like there was I can't remember which enemy it was. It was almost impossible to get a hit in as the cruiser. So you just like realize, okay, well, luck of the draw, I'm just going to lose this one. But then you got the the next one in the melee. So
yeah, there were definitely fights like that. So I think true fighting fans would say that this is very unbalanced, and we would agree with them, but we weren't creating a fighting game per se, but more like a rock paper scissors.
it was always fun, even when you just chose two battles. Like with very rare cases, I thought there was a fun battle, and that's really what it was about, right? Between almost all of them, which is, I imagine was a fair amount of. Was that a lot of work to get right?
I think, the way we approached it mostly was I would make all the ships and their powers. Just say, hey, wouldn't it be neat if this ship did this and that and the other thing? And then we would fiddle a little bit around with the like you said, the turn rate and the acceleration and the speed and stuff like that, until you didn't want a ship to just feel bad to play. So the ship had to feel good just to fly around on its own, um, even when you're not fighting somebody. And then as long as that felt good and the powers were satisfying, and then we would just play test a bunch, and we'd say, oh, okay, maybe we need to tone this down, or maybe we need to make him turn a little faster. And then we would say, okay, well, he feels good. He's, he's not going to beat this ship, but he's going to beat this one, and so we'll give him a cost that sort of reflects that those general capabilities.
Cool.
And I think the play as quickly as possible methodology. You brought up how I forget exactly how you put it. You say you wind up making, when you succeed, the successes kind of define you. And there's sort of an outward facing version of it, but maybe an inward facing. And I certainly don't want to speak for it. I didn't work on the Ur-Quan Masters, so I was confused and just a baby when that game was being played a lot. But something that I got a lot of Toys for Bob, and we still carry forward, is make it as easy as possible to get something playing, as fast as possible. And I guess my own spin on it is know if I need to throw it away as quickly as possible so that I could go on to make something else. Don't get invested, don't get attached, just try it. And this is much easier to imagine in sort of like a small team when we all were in like one like single room at Toys for Bob. It's just someone's walking by, wave at them, give them the controller, and just watch what happens. And that's the best education. And getting to that point as fast as possible, like prioritizing that kind of experimental prototyping, has been like, that's kind of the Toys for Bob secret sauce as far as I'm concerned. Maybe Fred, you have extra ingredients or multiple secret sauces, but that was one aspect that I really appreciate, and I sort of see in like the many games that have been made. Like, yeah, well, fun first, maybe rough at some edges, maybe some things got more love than others, but the core is, did I give this to someone and did they have fun with it? Okay, good.
Yep. Well, that's the only metric there is, right? Like,
but if you invest too much,
I've heard people say this game's objectively good or objectively bad or whatever. I'm like, there's no such thing. Like, if somebody, that's the only test. Is somebody enjoying it? Do they want to play more of it? And it's hard to get normally, especially as games like the games I've worked on, getting to that stage, because once you have a first person 3D game, there's a lot you have to do to get to that phase, and you have to go on faith for a really long time, because the fun is much, it just takes longer to find, because everything just takes longer, right? You've got a big 3D representation and rendering issues, and people falling out of the world, stuff that just didn't happen.
That could be fun
back in the earliest era. But yeah, I think getting people to also be willing to sit in front of other people and not guide them, and let them watch them play the game as gamers. Something that I'm sort of notorious for is I know how to break everything, not because I know where the bugs are, but because I know what designers want, how they want me to play it. And so if I have a good enough sense, like, they want me to go right here and do this. And if you do the opposite thing, A, it's important. It's a good way to find bugs. But B, getting developers comfortable just watching in silence somebody consume the game as a consumer would, who has no reason to say a nice word to you in the world, who has their time. There's a million things demanding their time, right? And I think it's hard for us to understand that we send our babies out into this cold, unforgiving world, and we've got to make sure they're as prepared as possible for that journey. And that's hard, because that requires a discipline, and it makes you see this thing you love and have to see its warts and its problems and its flaws and the things you love so much that now have to die because they don't work. Kill your babies is the phrase. And I think a lot of people they struggle to go of things that aren't working. And sometimes, and it's hard to know when that moment is, right? Is this thing just not working because we haven't tweaked it right? Or is it not working because it's just fundamentally unfun?
Unfundamentally.
Yeah, unfundamentally. And it's hard. You never really know the answer to that. I mean, I don't really have I'm happy to say goodbye to ideas that aren't working, because ideas are not the hard part, as I'm sure you guys know. It's execution.
Yes. Can somebody receive what you're putting out, and say, oh, I can use this. Oh, I can have fun with this. Yeah. Yeah, I think I have memory of the very first playtest I watched of my stuff, and I remember exactly what you described. I mean, I was very junior. I wasn't even drinking age yet, you know, and I'm like watching some like 6, 7 year old kid struggle with something that I did. And all I wanted to do is barge in the room and say, just turn over there. And I forget who said it to me, but I think it was either someone running the playtest or maybe even Paul, I don't know, or another designer just saying like, no, the point of this is when the player is playing the game, you're not going to be there to tell them anything. And this is your chance to see that. And I was like, oh, I'm making a child cry. Wow, I have a lot of power.
Very sad. No, Doug Church was working on Thief. Doug Church and I always used to joke, we include a README file explaining why the game was fun. Because you want to be able to tell people, but you're not going to be there. You might as well be dead. And you gotta write the game's your will, right? Your last one to testament, it's got to speak. It's because nobody else is going to be around to speak for it. And that's a very hard discipline. I think people really struggle with that. I see that happen a lot where people like tell the gamers to critique their game in a different way. You shouldn't ever say to a game developer X. And look, of course, I think all people should be, treat people with basic human decency and respect. So I'm not talking about that. But look, the audience is going to do that too sometimes, and you have to be prepared to see that. But no matter what form they deliver the criticism in, I think the key is knowing that as if you're the designer, you don't have to respond to it in that way, right? And they're never going to tell you what the answer is. They're going to may suggest what the answer is, but they're usually going to be wrong. But man, there's sometimes you just hear the nastiest thing and you realize, oh, there's something really important in there. The diamonds could be buried in piles of poop. And you got to be
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of our job, I was talking to someone about this fairly recently, is to not respond to every individual bit of critique. It's to like, we're data analysts too. I mean, gosh, I was outside of games, the word designer just means like, I mean, I'm in San Francisco and like, you want to talk about Silicon Valley. If you say you're a designer, someone's like, oh, what UIs have you worked on and what apps, and it's like, we're a product managerials. But even then it's like, no, we're kind of like data analysts. The point isn't to listen to someone and do exactly what they say. It's to interpret and say, oh, you're sort of like psychologist data analysts say, oh, you're suffering because of this. But then also, I mean, speaking of playtest stories, I remember it was Madagascar. I watched a kid just totally fail to complete a level for maybe 30 minutes, like complete failure, couldn't make it through the level. And it's like, every designer is just like, oh my gosh, we have to do something about this. And luckily I was not designing that level. So I didn't feel so bad personally. But then afterward, you talk to the kid and he's like, I loved that. This was so much fun.
You want them to play optimally, but that's not how people want to play. And that's not how they necessarily enjoy games. They want to bump into things and scratch your head, but you want them, and it's wrong. Like you say, it's the wrong instinct. But it's natural. You want them to play it, capably. But that's not what games are about. They're about experimenting and taking risks without really taking risk, right?
Yeah. And like letting people get, this, especially like, well, we're working on a very story-based game and you've had like tons of story-based stuff, but like one of the big challenges, like I feel anyway, I'm not a writer. I'm not the story. I always say I'm not the story guy, but because I'm surrounded by people who are thinking about it that way. It's not a book. So you're not going to experience that way, especially an open world game like the Ur-Quan Masters. But the thing I've been saying, and maybe I say this just so I feel better and I could be wrong, but whatever story you have in your head is never going to be as good as the story that the player is going to experience. And so it's almost like, upstaging or something. I'm a theater kid. So, it's like, hey, the idea here is the player's story, especially a game like the Ur-Quan Masters, where the fantasy is very much centered on you and you're the captain and you are the hero of the galaxy and you're going to do all these amazing things. You can encounter other side stories, other creatures, other characters doing amazing things and doing cool things. And you can be fascinated to learn about their story, but we can't necessarily predict. And maybe we don't even want to predict. I even read a story about saying like, we didn't even know the optimal way to play the game. There's a freedom in saying like, you know what, my story isn't going to be as good as the story of the player and whatever they come up with. And so like leaving the edges unfinished and letting the player have that. I'm curious what your relationship with that is, especially working with other game developers on like, well, how do you feel about that sentiment? And two, like, how do you communicate? Like, this is a player story. This is an interactive story. That's different. You know, people aren't used to it.
I agree with you 100%. Like people will ask me like, oh, what's the canon of this in BioShock or whatever? And I'm like, well, the canon is whatever you think the canon is, right? It's not mine. Once you finish it, it's not yours anymore, right? It's theirs. And I want them. I think there's not one Ur-Quan Masters. There's not one BioShock. There's as many people play it, that's as many different versions of it as that game as there are, because you encounter it where you meet it. And that's that's true for all forms of art, but it's uniquely true for video games because the amount the product can change, right? That's it. Most products, the physical novel can't morph, right? But the person meeting it is always different. But we morph on both sides. The person, we meet them where they're at in the game. They meet the game where it's at in variable states. And the more you can make I think the more, that's why the open world game, I think, as you guys were pioneers of, and then, then expanded out into, this sort of GTA open stat world style game that allows people to imprint more of themselves on the games. I think that's why they're so powerful. Because you're not feeling led around by, somebody telling you where to look, and what to do. And even if it's at a lower resolution, we talk a lot about, say like Minecraft is a good example, right? Of a game that I think it was in Java originally, right? It was incredibly, the voxels, very old technology from the 80s, basically. And the interface, if you guys ever played original, was like, basically non-existent. Very 1980s feeling, keyboard oriented. But it gave power to the people to make it theirs. And that game was a massive success. And you would never think, in the age of, huge AAA games that thing could have that kind of success. But it was saying, I'm yours, make with me what you will. And I think that is where we want to be moving to. Now, I'm not saying Minecraft specifically, but the more it's different for people, the more it's that they can carve it, the better it is. And that's the future of the form, I think. I'm convinced of that. So that's why I got in the industry. I played, Ultima Underworld, and I saw, the emergence, the expressivity. And I was like, and I still remember, I lived in the same house when I was playing Ur-Quan. I had the Genesis. I borrowed a friend's PC for a couple of weeks. He loaned it to me, and I didn't have any computers. And I got like Civilization, and I got Ultima Underworld, and that was like, oh, I think that's where the seed was planted that I needed to do this. I didn't know it quite then. It was a few years later, but those games really did it. And they were building upon, the open world stuff that you guys were doing in this very interesting, simpler form of like overhead games, right? But they all have this shared thing of just merging with the player and making a unique experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have my own version. I'm a little time lagged and also tech lagged because I didn't have access to that many computers, and we couldn't afford that much stuff. But
yeah, but you made effort because you got in very young. You started very, very young, which is great.
Yeah, I don't, unless you wanted it. My own story is just a series of fun accidents, I guess. I loved computers as a kid, and I would pick up anything, get my hands on. And I had like a Mac that my aunt gave to me when I was 6 years old. And I still have a photo. You can't see them now, but I have birds sitting on my monitor. I have a photo of me sitting there at like a black and white Mac 64K or something, playing a Breakout clone called Brickles, yeah, with two parrots on my shoulders and just sitting there staring entranced at like a ball bouncing around the screen. And like, I grew up going to this place called the Exploratorium, where my dad would do he volunteered for them, and he had a circuit board printing business. And so he would build parts for them. And for me as a child, like my fascination started, you said like, oh, there's a calling. My calling started really early when I realized I could push a button over here and something would happen over there. And whether it was mechanical, electronic, whatever, the idea of wait a minute, my input is abstracted and can become more. And the Exploratorium has this big like neon tube exhibit. That's a series of spinning neon tubes, and you can push a button to make it go faster and slower. And I have it on good word from my dad that I spent hours just staring at that thing, pushing all the buttons. And so like for me, the like this is story and this is powerful happened before I even knew what it like to speak. I'm pretty sure I didn't speak until I got a little bit older. I read a lot as a kid, but like push button thing happens, push button thing happens. I'm creating a story for what that is. And, you know, kids have imagination. And so I grew up on MUDs actually. So text-based, like
Yep.
talk about emergent gameplay. It's like you could spin up a MUD, you could invent a new story, you could get people to collaborate with your story. I didn't discover D&D until much later. But that was where a lot of my time went as a kid, you know, with MUDs, and then getting into actual industry stuff was also what you were talking about, which is modding, you know, and talk about making things your own, you know.
As rendering got better, it just basically opened the door to more and more people, because like there were weird nerds like us who could look at the very crude early, you know, I was playing games with the TRS-80, right? And, you know, like there was nothing to look at. You had to do so much of the blank filling in yourself. And I think that I remember my parents, until BioShock, they didn't really understand what I even did because they could even with System Shock 2, they couldn't look at System Shock 2 and understand it was a spaceship or something. That it was so abstract because the rendering ability, you know, power was so limited that it is interesting to see the audience expand as more and more people go, oh, like I understand what that is. And they have, you know, some people, what happened, and, you know, there's probably you know, Fred, and when you and I were younger, very few people were into this stuff because it was too weird. And
Yeah, did you go to the game developers conferences at all early on when there were like 25 people there to start? And then
yeah, I mean, it was a very rinky dink, you know, really until the 2000s, it was pretty rinky dink. You know, when I got in 95, it was pretty rinky dink, and you were there even earlier. Like the amount of money was very, you know, and the audience size was pretty small relative to now. And now it's like everybody.
Yeah.
Which is good.
I have some fairly old-fashioned parents, and they're very I say this with love, Dad, if you ever watch this, I love you. But I'm a very traditionally Jewish father, I guess I'll say. And he would always ask me when I was working in Toys for Bob, are you sure this is a real job? He just really wasn't sure. And this is after I said, you know, oh, I'm not going to college. I'm not going to become a doctor or a lawyer or all the things you wanted me to do, whatever that is. And
does he get it? Does he get it now?
He gets it now, you know. I think but you know, there's still a little, it's just funny because my dad is such a hippie and a pioneer of his own, you know, that he's a musician and all kinds of things. And there's this element of just, you know, it's his own way of being caring and loving, but also him, again, just what you said, not getting it. And I was very, very lucky. I had an uncle who supported my technology fantasies when I was young, and eventually bought me some equipment, and I learned 3D modeling when I was 13, I think, which is like pretty young and cool. And that's only because my uncle was like, no, I think this is worth this time. And this is when, you know, Lightwave 3D cost whatever, $400 for a package, and you had a physical like parallel port dongle you had to attach for it to run. And it's like, I didn't have any money as a kid, but my uncle was successful in technology. And that's, yeah, doing modeling and that sort of stuff. My parents just watched me sit in my room for hours staring at a glowing screen making spaceships, and they're like, this isn't real, this isn't going to go anywhere. And then it turns into a job, and my dad was not so sure. Now he buys it.
To be fair, it is kind of a ridiculously great job, because you do get to sit around and like model fucking, oh, sorry if I don't know if I've
you can drop as many F-bombs as you want. There's no FCC here.
like it's not reasonable that somebody should be paid for sitting around and modeling spaceships all day, but we work in an industry where you do get paid to sit around and model spaceships all day sometimes, or, you know, talk about these ridiculously fantastical storylines that you come up with in your head and imagine worlds. And I never forget how lucky I am to have been, you know, born at a time where there was a new medium that was pretty, the barriers of entry were pretty low, you know, and I still think gaming in general, like compared to like I worked in Hollywood, and like there's no, so you don't have to have an agent to get in the games industry, right? You know, you don't have to go through this sort of, there are ways to get in on the ground level like QA that are, you know, that I've had a ton of people come up through QA in my organization to major serious, you know, roles in the company.
Yeah, that happened at Toys for Bob too.
Yep. And when I said serious, I mean QA is actually an extremely serious thing, because one thing that you probably, I didn't even know what QA was when I came, and I remember experiencing QA for the first time on on System Shock 2, and like being like, oh my god, like you can have people deconstruct fun, and I didn't realize how much of the game was just getting it working. And you know, like what a process that was just to get things working before you even saw there was fun. But sorry, I had to diverge on QA because it sounded like I was giving them some salt. Um, the So yeah, I think it's you know, it's a great job to have, and I'm sure your uncle has always been excited because he got it right.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, my uncle got it. You know, he also, speaking of industries and timing and things like that, he actually ran a copy shop of all the interesting things to do over on the East Coast. So eventually became very successful and became a chain. And if you were living in Boston at the right time, and I were to say copy cop, that would mean something to you. But for most people, it means nothing. But you know, it's like he was like a Kinko's
Yep,
eventually
yep,
at
yep.
the height of it. And I, you know, again, I don't know what this is. This is just coming up. We're all talking about past. So I guess I'm getting into my past here. I'm like, oh, I didn't think I'd talk about this today, but here we go. I remember my formative experiences with my relatives was like, oh, visit your grandma, sit there, be nice, give her hugs, do all this sort of stuff, visit your aunts, and I, no flack on any of my family, but my uncle was just different because it's like time to spend time with your uncle. Okay, he's the CEO of some organization and he puts me in his like Toyota like Land Rover or whatever, not Land Rover, whatever. He had a big Toyota truck because he'd lug around equipment and stuff, and he was a big guy. And time to go to work with my uncle. That was visiting my uncle. It's like, well, I don't really have time to hang out with my nephew, but here, I'm going to take you to my office. And he'd tell me what he does as a CEO. And he says, now we're going to visit this branch. There's a manager. Do you know what a manager does? I'm like 7 years old, 8 years old, and I'm being talked to like an adult. And he tells me, here's why I need a manager, because the manager takes care of all these things for me. And then he'd go have a meeting and he would put me in front of a computer that was more powerful than anything I could ever get my hands on. And I'd get Photoshop like 3.0 or something. And I would just sit there forever. And he had, because he had a big printing business, he had printers like half the size of my apartment and would make posters of my artwork. Kids art. So it's sort of the supercharged, technologically driven version of like putting your kids artwork on the fridge. That's what my uncle was for me in technology. Because if I modeled a spaceship, I'd send him a file and he would print out a poster, like seriously, that I could fill the room with. And I remember when we first was in the Mars rover. Yeah, when we landed the Mars rover, he got a like super high resolution image of that panorama and made a poster for me to hang on the wall. And so a lot of my childhood was just like a 6-foot poster of the panorama of the Mars rover going, look at what technology and art can do together. This is so cool. I love this. And so it was very influential for me. And nice to have someone who really
Like,
did get it and supported me that way. I'm very lucky. I'm seriously lucky.
sounds like a nice uncle.
He is, yeah. I mean, he still is. He's retired now and collects scrimshaw whalebone carvings and is something of a scrimshaw expert. So that's his hobby in his older years. But yeah, it's interesting you mentioned like getting in with going from Hollywood to games. I'm curious. I mean, sorry if everybody's asked you about this, you can say, watch another interview. but I'm just curious, like how was that for you, and what did you take with you, and what did you leave behind?
Um,
Oh, I think we lost your video, but
oh, you did? Lost my video? Oh, I don't know what happened there. Okay, there it is. Oh yeah, I had a I was originally going to be a screenwriter, and I worked I got a job like right out of college, doing a rewrite for a studio, and I've told this story a million times, so I won't bore anybody too much with it. But it turns out my fate was not to be a screenwriter, because I got one gig and then could not get a second job. Um, and I sort of like thought that was I was going to be that. I had this brief moment of this big potential for this big career, and it didn't happen, right? And you kind of think after that, okay, well, I had a shot, and it took me a few years to get my head around, like, oh, I did other jobs for a whole bunch of years until I was like 28 or 29, and then I was like, well, I need to do something. I need to be working in a creative field. So what field is there? And games is something I played, since, I've been saying, for this whole conversation, since, the first Pong machine appeared near my house, that just, even before that, these electromechanical arcade games that, didn't use screens, that had, various clockwork type, items. And I got lucky. I got a second bite at the apple at a creative life. After an aborted first one, not a lot of people can get a shot at the first one. I thought but I'm really happy how it turned out, because we're still breaking ground today, on what we do, because this isn't the final form. Like, movies are great, they're awesome. I'm a huge movie fan, but they're in their final form. You can continue to innovate on style and aesthetics and things like that, but everybody knows what a movie is right now, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, because when movies started, they also, like games, when we were working, nobody knew what a genre was, right? They didn't even know what a movie was. They thought it was like a film play, and then they started developing a language of film. So I think that I'm really lucky that I screwed my first big shot at fame and success, because I got to be here. I had to live a few years in the in the penalty box of life, doing jobs I hated. But I think it turned out all right in the end.
It's inspiring. I hope to someday also do some jobs I hate so that I have a wonderful life. No, I'm kidding. I know we've eaten
you
up a
guys
bunch
did
of
this
your
since
time.
the beginning. You are the penalty box of life is not great. Like, of having to do jobs that you're just staring at the clock all day. It's not a great experience. And it's good to know. It helps to remind me how lucky I am, because I had that experience. But so I'm grateful every day. I know that sounds like kind of glib, but I really am, because it's so much fun what we do.
In high school, I worked at Der Wiener Schnitzel. Does that count?
I'm sure you stared at that Wiener Schnitzel clock waiting for the day to end, right?
I delivered pizza, so
Yeah.
it's I'm
There's this
happy to
first
have
day.
had that.
There was a first day I remember when I had to go do a real job, and I went on the street, and I was on the street with all the other commuters. Something I always thought was a different world. And I'm like, oh, this is my first day of commute of how many days till I die? You know, it was hard, because I made the best of it. I figured out ways to, like, I actually started a small, like, computer consulting business, and it was good. I liked the clients, and I got to like it. But there are some jobs which people go to every day because they have to, and I'll never not be grateful for what I get to do every day.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
can relate to
definitely
that a lot. Yeah, go
feel
for it.
that way now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I want for the future, is to wake up excited for what's going to happen during the day and not exactly sure what is about to happen too. I need a little bit of that. I guess that's what makes you a creative person. I think everyone's creative, but cool. Well, I mean, I know we've eaten a bunch of your time, and I don't want to hold you forever. Can I like fanboy for just 30 seconds? I'll be
Sure.
really quick.
Sure.
I loved Freedom Force. My friends and I played LAN parties back when people actually did that, and we would get together and play at my friend's house in their upstairs. We couldn't even use the house. We would sit like all cram in the bedroom. I would sit in the bathroom because there was no room, and we would sit around and we just play games all the time. And like Freedom Force for me was like so impressionable, especially in the sense of like storytelling together and being together, that like when we started doing Skylanders, the short version of this is we had effectively 4 prototypes for Skylanders, and they were all a co-op like Diablo light kind of game. And so when we were doing that, I toted that out because nobody knew what game I was talking about. I'm like, what? How did you not play this? This was amazing. My friends and I sunk hours into it. So I loaded it up at Toys for Bob, got people sitting around seeing it, showing the UI and all of that, and say, look how much fun you can have together with other people. It's so cool. So I just wanted to say, like, I'll stop here. But I just want to say thank you so much. I know you worked on that, and like it was very influential for me.
It's a letter of love to, like, the Silver Age of comics. And I probably went too far into that because that was so important to me. But I was older than a lot of the audience, I think. And so I probably would have been smarter if I did something more for like comics from the 90s. But I just love the era of comics so much. I just wanted to write. I never ran a game where I just completely aped somebody's style before, both visually and, from a writing standpoint and from an art standpoint. It was Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. Because it was a letter of love to those guys.
Well, it came through to young me. It definitely inspired me, and I still think about it. And I was still thinking about it when I was working on Skylanders and everything. And even before we were talking, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to say this. I'm so sorry. You probably hear this all the time, but I have to.
This is what happens. His games inspire me as a developer. My game inspired you, and then you inspire somebody else, and we're all in debt to each other, right? Because we all stand on each other's shoulders, and that's the way it should work. It should be, and it makes us better.
Yeah, and that's why, like, seriously, really appreciate your time today too. And like, this is what this is about too, and being able to share this with our community who like loves to see these connections. So yeah, we are gonna share the video out, and we'll let you know when that happens and everything, and you can have copies and whatever. But this is just a lot for love letter is a good way to put it. Like, this sort of thing is, we appreciate sharing, giving, receiving, and thank you so much for your kind words too.
Great. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed this. It was
really enjoyed meeting you.
Honor to meet you, Fred.
Yeah, honor to meet you as well.
Yeah, I'm honored to meet you as well.
And my best to everybody at the company, and I'll always be playing your games. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. Have a great one.